Stupid shitting Tudor dramas! The Laughing Cavalier here, presenting to you another tale of these troubled times. Today, I will be doing a video I, yet again, wasn't expecting to do, but I felt that now we've had the release of The Spanish Princess and the Mary Queen of Scots movie, I should delve back into the topic of Tudor dramas, and see if my predictions from my first video were right, and also mention anything else that these productions got wrong. First off, the Mary Queen of Scots movie. Yep, as I predicted, this one was pretty bad. If you're not familiar with the history behind the real Mary Queen of Scots, then, briefly, Mary Stuart inherited the throne of Scotland as a 6-day-old baby, but was forced to flee to France when she was 6 due to an English invasion. She did not return until she was 18, and in her absence the country had gone through a reformation, which had put the French-educated and highly Catholic Mary at loggerheads with her own church and nobility. She was rocked by scandal when her husband, Lord Darnley, was blown up. Not long afterwards she ran off with a Lord Bothwell, but was soon tracked down and forced to abdicate. She escaped, though, and raised an army, but was defeated at the Battle of Langside. She then fled to England to seek the protection of her cousin Queen Elizabeth I, whom was certainly no friend of the Queen of Scots. Mary would spend the next 19 years under house arrest in England, with all sorts of Catholic plots circling around her due to her claim on the English throne. Finally, Elizabeth reluctantly signed Mary's death warrant, and she was rather clumsily beheaded in what has to be one of the most botched executions in history. As you can see, this is a pretty interesting topic, but sadly it has been butchered numerous times. I already mentioned in part 1 what Rant did to the Mary Queen of Scots story, but today we are looking at the 2018 movie. This won't be a proper review of the film like with my 6 Wives series, although I did make more than enough notes during my viewing of it to make an hour-long video, so I'm going to keep this as brief as I can. Firstly, some predictions I actually got wrong to varying degrees. One amendment I will make to my part 1 rant is that at least she does speak French in a few scenes, so well done, you did at least mention that. Obviously, she didn't speak any French in the trailer, so I was pleasantly surprised to see her speaking French on a few occasions. However, she still speaks with a Scottish accent despite having grown up in France, which still bugs me. Yes, she certainly did speak Scots, not to be confused with Gaelic, which she could not speak, but she spent most of her youth in France and had been educated as a princess of that country. Would it not be better for her to have at least a different accent from the Scottish characters to emphasise how different she was from them, being seen almost as a foreigner? Now, granted, even Elizabeth R, arguably the best series on this era, has them all speaking with English accents, even people like Philip of Spain, but at the very least these were the natural accents of the actors. Mary is putting on a Scottish accent, which to me makes no sense since her actress isn't Scottish. Just have her with either her natural accent or a French accent of some sort to emphasise the differences between her and her subjects. A further correction, in some scenes the characters do wear cloaks when they are riding, but in others they don't, and they are still not wearing hats. 1 or 2 characters wear hats all the time, but most don't, despite the fact that they are riding around in cold and rainy weather, where you would want to protect yourself. And finally, filming locations. I'm going to go into a bit more detail about this shortly, but a few scenes at Elizabeth's court were filmed at Hardwicke Hall, which does have the wood panelling associated with Tudor palaces, so at least in a few scenes it is accurate. Well, now on to the rant proper. As I suspected, this film has its fair share of inaccuracies. Whilst it does at least broadly follow the events that happened, so better than Rant at least, it did make some odd choices. For example, the Earl of Warwick's rebellion against Mary in 1565 is shown as being backed by the English, which is not quite true. Well, for the start at least. Cecil certainly did not organise this rebellion, and did not send muskets to help Moray. How do we know this? Well, the English diplomat Thomas Randolph, writing back to the English court, said that Moray's men lacked arquebusiers. So why on earth are they shown receiving them from the English when the English themselves said the rebels didn't have them? The only English support came towards the end of the rebellion when one 18-gun ship attempted to prevent Mary from bringing in munitions from France, but was driven off. Granted, Thomas Randolph himself was accused of giving money to Moray, based off of the fact that Moray had asked for some money, but this was a mere accusation, and it is doubtful he had actually given him this money. This film also shows an actual battle taking place, with Mary being portrayed as some sort of tactical genius, laying an ambush for the rebels. In reality, there was little fighting. In fact, the whole rebellion is usually referred to as the Chase-About Raid, since Moray's smaller force refused to give battle, and was thus chased all over Scotland. Whilst he did flee to Carlisle, Queen Elizabeth I was not happy with his presence and summoned him to Westminster to explain himself. Can I just state as well that some of the stuff written about this film prior to release was rather misleading, which is not the film's fault, mind you, but still. This article claimed the focus would be on the Northern Rebellion against Elizabeth in 1569, yet there is literally not a single mention of it in the film, unless you count Elizabeth's counsel warning her against Catholics supporting Mary being a reference. That aside, why on earth did they put emphasis on Moray's rebellion? I'm not sure. It is really bewildering since the Marian War following her escape from Lochleven is completely left out from the film and she just flees to England, whereas in reality she raised an army and actually did lead it in battle against Moray's forces. Why did you not show that battle instead? One thing I have to criticise this film for is that it opens with her arrival in Scotland and her life prior to that point is glossed over. We then gallop forward the plot at a really fast pace, leaving you confused as to what year we are in. In one scene, she's just arrived in Scotland, which would be in 1561. A couple of scenes later, Darnley has arrived, which historically was in 1565, yet it feels like only a few months have passed. Of course, when you're doing a film covering such momentous events, it is always difficult to fit it into a 2-hour time frame. The 1972 film, Henry VIII and His Six Wives, suffered from this as well. The worst example being Catherine of Aragon's speech before Henry at the Legatine Court in 1528, and then the next scene being in 1533 with Cromwell and Cranmer discussing marrying Anne to Henry, meaning that 5 years and the entire Reformation have just been glossed over. However, that film did the time jump thing better since, firstly, it was told from the point of view of Henry on his deathbed, reminiscing about his reign. So you might have one scene, then it cuts back to him on his deathbed, then fades back in into the next scene, which may jump forward a few months or even years. The second thing they did right was to show the characters visibly aging. Some, of course, like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, aren't around for long, so you don't need to age them. But Keith Michelle does age, as do other characters like Catherine of Aragon, the Duke of Suffolk, and so on. Whilst the Mary Queen of Scots film does show Elizabeth aging, and showing her getting the pox and losing her hair, this does not happen with Mary, who looks the exact same throughout the film. Hell, she barely even changes from this blue dress. This is a bit jarring in the first/last scene showing her execution, since she looks like she's in her 20s when the real-life Mary was 44. Granted, people did comment at the time that she was still beautiful, but even so. Now, I'll have to bring up some casting choices, and I want to get this first point out of the way quickly. Unlike the Spanish Princess series, who did at least have some black characters who actually existed, the Mary Queen of Scots movie cast some black and Asian actors in European roles. I know I'm going to get some flack for saying this, but please remember I am the same guy who criticised Tamsin Merchant for being blonde and being a few years too old to play the auburn-haired teenage Catherine Howard. The 16th century was a highly unequal time compared to the present, and when I watch something set in this era, I would rather it be shown as what it was and not given a modern update. You could have found somewhere to fit in a black or Asian actor if you wished. Even the TV series Elizabeth R showed a black minstrel at the court of Catherine de Medici, so you could have created a character like that. Hell, might have even been interesting to have a minstrel who goes with her from France, who you could have used as a point of view character, but you didn't do that. Sure, you cannot get every actor to look like the historical counterparts, but part of the magic of cinema is being immersed in the world presented so much that you cannot tell you're watching actors. Keith Michelle, Glenda Jackson and so on took on their roles with perfection. Hell, they don't even need to perfectly resemble a person as long as they are believable. To use a more modern example, Colin Firth in The King's Speech did a very good job as portraying King George VI, even if he didn't look like him. The effort was made, though, with his voice and the costumes he wears. I can understand if you're doing a small amateur dramatic production in your local theatre company, where you might not have a wide choice of actors. Hell, when I was 10 I had to play a pirate, and since I don't have a massive beard they painted it on, so I ended up looking like an Oompa Loompa who had joined ISIS. However, that was a school play. When you have a multi-million-pound film, you have the luxury of casting effectively who you like. You'll never get every detail perfect, particularly things like eye colour and so on, but please at least make the effort to find people who feel like these historical figures, and try to make sure the period feels like that period. Following on from that, there are some other casting choices I really do not agree with. Saoirse Ronan, and yes I did try to pronounce it accurately this time, is alright as Mary, but there's just something lacking in my mind. I think she overdoes Mary's resilience, if that is the right way to put it. Sure, she did have to face a lot of trials and tribulations, mainly from people like Moray, Knox and so on, but I feel like they gloss over some of the mistakes she made in order to emphasise her resilience to the fallout from them. The best example being her relationship with Rizzio, who historically was probably quite corrupt, yet here is really portrayed as a lovable fool. Also, while Saoirse is technically within the right age range, being about 23 or 24 when she read this, whilst the real-life Mary was, not counting the first and last scenes, aged between 18 and 25, I still think they should have got a slightly older actress to play the role. In the portraits of Mary, she always looks quite mature, even when she was 16. I think Saoirse looks a tad too young to convincingly represent her, and it would have made more sense to cast somebody slightly older, since you could have aged him a bit more for when you get to the execution scene. The one scene I really hated, though, was towards the end of the film, when they meet in some farmer's house in the middle of nowhere. Historically, the two queens never met, although nearly every film about Mary shows her meeting Elizabeth, and from a narrative standpoint, you would naturally want the two main rivals to meet, so I can sort of understand it. What I do not understand, though, is why, after Elizabeth literally promises to take in Mary and keep herself, Mary blurts out this.
I will not be scolded by my inferior.
Your inferior?
I am a Stuart, which gives me greater claim to England than you possess.
Why would you openly state something so treasonous in front of the woman who has the power of life and death over you? Granted, back when she was Queen of Scots, she was making claims on Elizabeth's throne, but once she was imprisoned in England, she did not openly go around stating that she wanted the crown. There was the whole Pavane plot thing, but that was done secretly and, as far as she was aware, without Elizabeth's knowledge. Not to mention the whole thing was effectively an entrapment scheme pushed by Walsingham. Over in Elizabeth's court, the actor who played Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, really did not fit the image I have of him. Perhaps I've been a bit spoiled by Robert Hardy's portrayal of him in Elizabeth R, but I've always seen him as being more arrogant and a bit of a flatterer than what was shown in this film. And again, the physical resemblance isn't good. He looks like some young kid as opposed to a 30-something gentleman and close friend of the Queen. Speaking of the Queen, I'm not too overly keen on Margaret Robbie as Elizabeth I. She's way too gentle in this. Remember, Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII and had as bad a temper as her father. In this film, she barely raises her voice and even meekly agrees to settle on quite a few things. Again, I've probably been spoiled by Glenda Jackson's portrayal of Elizabeth, but a much more assertive Queen would have been better. As mentioned, I will give them props for showing her getting smallpox and losing her hair. However, historically Mary also had little to no hair at the end, although I'll get onto that in a moment. The worst choices have to be the Scots Noble in this film, particularly Moray. Character-wise, he's shown plotting against her almost from the word go. In reality, he did remain loyal to her at first, even crushing a rebellion against her in 1562. Whilst he did oppose her in matters of religion before then, it was really the Darnley marriage that finally drove him over the edge. Also, his physical appearance is just terrible. I want you for a moment to look at this painting of the historical Moray. To me, he looks very much like a nobleman. He has short, well-kept hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Now let's have a look at him in this film. Why on earth does he look like a cross between an ex from Braveheart and a Dothraki from Game of Thrones? That brings me quite neatly onto my other main peeve with this film, and that is costumes and scenery. The costumes look even worse in this one than I feared. Everyone in Elizabeth's court is wearing black for some reason, so it feels more like a funeral, and even the costumes they are wearing don't look very Tudor. I mean, just look at this black leather thing Dudley is wearing. Compare that to these portraits of him. Notice the difference. He has a lot more colourful attire as befitting a nobleman of his rank, and also, changes his outfit from time to time like human beings do. Elizabeth presided over a court full of colourful costumes, which you clearly had the budget to show, yet you went for this all-black theme. Mary's court is no better, with everyone being in blue for some reason. The worst thing for me, though, is that the clothes are made of denim. Yes, that is right, denim, which didn't come about till the 19th century. The costume designer had this to say in her choice of denim in the film. Given all the artistic, contextual and budget choices, I landed on the idea very quickly of using denim. It's not true to period, but artistically, the reason why I chose it is I wanted the clothes to have an immediacy and accessibility. I wanted the men to be sexy, and Elizabethan pumpkin breeches are not sexy. I also wanted fabric that got better with wear, because Elizabethans didn't have dry cleaners, so that got me thinking. On the practical front, weather in Scotland, where we were shooting, can be rain, hail and sun in one day, and the clothes were going to get wet and muddy. I was also very interested in limiting my materials so I could manipulate the fabric to tell a story. I don't know where to start. Why is it imperative that the men be sexy? I mean, when I look at these portraits, I don't think, oh, poor blimey, what a hunk. If only he were in denim. And yet they didn't have dry cleaners because it's the 16th century. It's a pretty grim time period. And if, say, Mary's marching around with her army, then she wouldn't have access to her servants like she usually would to clean her clothes. Besides, what about all the soldiers and peasants that would probably have looked a bit mucky? I doubt their clothes would get better with wear. That reminds me, why don't the Scots soldiers wear any sort of headgear, save for one or two helmets and bonnets here and there? I mean, they're not so poor that they would not be wearing something to protect their head, particularly if they're going into battle with arrows and musket balls flying everywhere. At least with Mary's execution, they sort of got it right, with her wearing a black dress and then removing it to reveal a red petticoat underneath. For some laughable reason, though, they literally rip off the black dress. I mean, look at it, it's hilarious. Even the red petticoat isn't accurate in terms of style nor colour, since it was described as being more brownish red in colour, like the colour of blood. Then I have to ask, why is the block so low down? The low block was a thing, but if it were like that, then the victim would lie down. It should be a bit higher, really. Finally, for whatever reason, they miss out the gory details of the actress taking 2 or more blows to cut off her head, her wig falling off, and so on. You could have at least referenced that and had Elizabeth react to the news of the gory details as a tragic way to end the film, but there we go. The sets are even worse. As mentioned, you do get 1 or 2 good period locations like Hardwicke Hall, but at Elizabeth's court you get scenes filmed in Gloucester Cathedral, which is a religious building, and looks nothing like the council chambers Elizabeth would usually meet her Privy Council in. Not least since her council is massive in this film. Briefly, during the Tudor era, the monarch would have a Privy Council, who would advise the Queen. Its members would usually consist of important officials, such as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Lord Chancellor, and the leading nobles of the realm, depending on the monarch's choice. Elizabeth reduced the size of her Privy Council upon her accession, which was only a few years before the start of this film, with it being about 19 strong. Granted, Mary's had up to 50 members, but Elizabeth deliberately made it smaller, since she wanted to be more efficient and, no doubt, wanted less opposition to her in the council. In this film, though, I count 41 members of her council, and at least 6 secretaries writing minutes of the proceedings. It might seem a pedantic point, but authenticity is important if you wish your audience to believe you are actually in this world. I certainly do not believe I am in the Tudor era when this is literally what Holyrood Palace looks like. For reference, part of the original 16th century palace still exists, including Mary's room. So explain to me where in Holyrood there is a massive stone wall that looks like something I would see in an Elder Scrolls game. Not to mention you had to pay money to make that set. So if you're going to make a set, why not try and at least make it look like something that is period appropriate? Some people will probably say I'm being unduly harsh in this film, so I will now try and go over some things I think it did all right. David Tennant as John Knox was actually pretty good. Granted, he looked like Rasputin in most of it, but the real-life John Knox did look something like that. And he does have a hat, so well done. He was quite preachy as well, although sadly isn't in the film too much, and save for 1 or 2 scenes with Mary, most of his screen time made with him shouting,
Whore of Babylon, murderous harlot, Queen Strumpet!
The actor playing Cecil wasn't too bad either, although I do have to ask what medallion he is wearing. I don't think I've seen any sort of English Order of Chivalry with that insignia. Not to mention, as a member of the Privy Council, he should be wearing some sort of chain of office showing his rank. As mentioned, the film did at least broadly follow the chronology of events from Mary's arrival in Scotland to her abdication and execution. But again, the plot went too fast, missed out quite a few important events, like Mary trying to get her crown back by force, and will be brought to a screeching halt by the love scenes in this film. Again, I am a bit of a moral Puritan, but still, the plot is already so fast-paced that these sort of scenes really do slow it down and take away from the screen time that could have been used to look at the politics and events more. Overall then, this film was not that good, and I found it rather forgettable like many recent Tudor dramas. It was allegedly based off the book by John Guy, but whilst it did follow the chronology somewhat, it completely failed to really show the true characters of these people. I think this is best summed up by the tagline used on the poster. Under Elizabeth it says, "Born to power," whilst under Mary it says, "Born to fight." But these taglines are basically the wrong way round. Mary became queen when she was a mere baby, and despite the rough wooing by the English and her fleeing to France, she was recognised as the legitimate queen throughout. She was literally born to power, and it was only after the Darnley marriage that things really started to unravel. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was the one born to fight, I would say. Her mother was beheaded when she was 3, and Elizabeth herself was declared a bastard. She had to watch as her father went through a host of more wives, including Catherine Howard, who the then 8-year-old Elizabeth was quite fond of, apparently even saying to Dudley some time after Catherine's execution that she would never marry. She was then effectively abused by Sir Thomas Seymour when she was 15, was imprisoned at the Tower of London by her sister Mary, with all sorts of plots and even the threat of execution hanging over her. Even when she secured the crown, she had men like the Duke of Norfolk and Sir Anthony Babington plot against her, as well as facing opposition on religious and domestic matters as well. If anyone was born to fight, then it was Elizabeth. In this film, though, it is completely backwards, and it is a shame since people are crying out for a decent historical drama. The closest we have to come to that is Wolf Hall, and even that has a few issues. On the topic of Henry VIII, let us now look at the series The Spanish Princess, which I not only covered in the first Rant video, but also in a video I did going through the trailer and my predictions. I've only seen the first 3 episodes since my blood pressure cannot take it anymore, so I cannot comment on it in its entirety, but I have seen enough to formulate an opinion, which is the most polite way I can put it. First off, some predictions I got wrong. Thankfully, that wasn't Catherine of Aragon on that horse charging into battle against the Moors. However, it turns out it was Isabella of Castile doing a Zena on the Moors, whilst a teenage Catherine watches on. And that is still pretty bad, in my opinion. Firstly, why are they even fighting the Moors in the first place? Granted, there was a rebellion, but as far as I'm aware, Catherine was not ambushed en route to England. Would it not have been better to have a flashback to Catherine as a child with her family at, say, the fall of Granada, with her seeing how powerful her parents are, which then inspires her? Secondly, why do you have to have Isabella fighting hand-to-hand with the Moors? Sure, she was there with the army when Granada fell, but not every general in history has to fight personally. Henry VIII led his army to France on more than one occasion, but he was very important, so he stayed behind with his bodyguards. You could easily have shown her as a good ruler through her planning and plotting and so on. Having her fight hand-to-hand when she did not do that historically does not automatically make her a strong character. I mean, I like the film Tora 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 about the attack on Pearl Harbor. I did not sit down and think, I wish they had gotten Yamamoto's wife, dressed her up as a samurai, and got her to do a kamikaze attack on the Arizona. Second thing I got wrong, the soundtrack isn't retro-modern, thank the heavens, although it is too bland and generic for my liking. They could have taken a piece of music written from the period and adapted it, a bit like the documentary Henry VIII's Mind of a Tyrant did with some of Henry's works. Before we get on to the plot proper, I have to, yet again, complain about false information being put out about the details regarding these shows. Back when I did my rant about the trailer, the Internet Movie Database was claiming that Wolsey and Margaret Tudor were in one episode. Now it is saying they are in 5. If you don't know the correct information, then don't put it out there, please. Now on to the rant proper. Good God, did I hate watching this. When I saw the first episode, it dragged on for so long. I thought I had been watching it for an hour. It turns out I was only 20 minutes in. From a narrative standpoint, the whole thing just drags on so slowly. The point I've gotten to is at the end of episode 3, where Elizabeth of York has just died. So we've barely gotten to 1503, when the series starts in 1501, and I thought the 6 Wives for Henry VIII took too long. There really is not enough source material that justifies it being stretched out so long, like
butter scraped over too much bread.
Added to that, the really awkward love scenes that go nowhere and bring the plot to a grinding halt, pardon the pun. And talking about the plot, exactly how does it hold up compared to the history? Not great, I'm afraid. Much like the Mary Queen of Scots movie, it plays some of the right historical notes, but not necessarily in the right order, if you catch my meaning. The plot is centred around Catherine of Aragon and her struggle to become the Queen, with a few side plots like Margaret Tudor being married off to the King of Scots, Margaret Pole and her trials and tribulations, and the love life of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. As I feared, the last of these plot lines is not good. Whilst Lena did exist, she would certainly not be looking to be married off to an English nobleman. She was a minor servant and is barely mentioned in historical records, yet the series makes out she's one of the Queen's closest confidants, which, by the way, why does she only have one other lady-in-waiting, and a fictional one at that? Catherine would have brought a fair few with her when she arrived, and had an entourage of 60 people, yet I count less than 20. Apparently this Lena has been muddled up with the Spanish Dona Catalina de Cardenas, who was a lady-in-waiting, whilst this Catalina was probably nothing more than a slave, who changed bed linen and so on. Also, Moorish in this era was usually used to describe people of North African descent, although Sir Thomas More did say Catherine had Ethiopian servants, so I'll leave you to decide on the accuracy of the casting. Not present at all is Don Elvira, who was a major figure in Catherine's entourage at this point, and was a close ally of Catherine's sister, Joanna of Castile. Again, see the 6 Wives series to see that part portrayed correctly. With the Spanish princess, though, you also get ridiculous bits like Lena going down the local pub with the Moorish crossbow maker Oviedo. I wish you'd make up your mind if she's a low-ranking servant or a lady-in-waiting. Also, they make out that Oviedo has somehow managed to stay a Muslim despite the fact that it was demanded of Catherine's servants that they be Catholic. Considering this is an era where the Spanish Inquisition is active, I highly doubt he would have been appointed to Catherine's entourage, since they would have discovered his secret long before then. Granted, Dr. de Puebla was a convert from Judaism, and was made ambassador in spite of his past, but the way they present it in the show just is not right. The second divergent plotline focuses on Margaret Pole, and is not done very well either. I don't know why they're focusing on the execution of her brother a few years prior. Yes, his death was one of the conditions for the Spanish marriage, and according to Margaret's son Reginald, she did talk about it with Catherine when they first met. But it was not an impediment, since Margaret knew the 15-year-old Catherine herself was not at fault. In fact, she became a close friend of Catherine, and was a major supporter of her cause decades later during the King's Great Matter. So why is she so hostile to Catherine thus far in the series? Oh, and the plotline with Margaret Tudor is pretty bad as well, but I will expand on that in a moment. The main focus, though, is on Catherine, and it is not done well. Catherine is written as something of a scheming politician who's really nasty and argumentative with people like Margaret Pole right off the bat, which is just not true. She was very pious and had a desire to do her duty. That was her motivating desire. Hell, nearly all the characters in this are argumentative with each other. In reality, people like Elizabeth of York and Margaret Beaufort were very kind to Catherine when she arrived, and Elizabeth herself, after Arthur's death, seemed to be positioning herself as something of a mentor to Catherine, even going so far as to try and learn Spanish. We don't seem to get this, though. Everyone seems to treat her like dirt. Even Elizabeth looked like she's about to kill her when they first meet in that weird scene where she intimidated her. I mean, if the historical Elizabeth of York did that to the daughter of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom, then you can kiss that alliance but goodbye. Historically, a lot of it just doesn't make sense. We get nearly 10 minutes at the start of her travelling across Spain to England, where, in this version, she's ambushed by the Moors, but Isabella charges into battle, as I have previously ranted about. They do at least show the journey by sea taking its toll, which is accurate, but then it really jumps the old shark. For example, when she's sailing over to England, instead of landing at Southampton, she orders the ship stopped and they land on a random beach in the middle of nowhere. Then they ride on what looks like a dung cart to Dogmansfield House. Well, firstly, the historical Catherine landed at Plymouth when she couldn't get to Southampton. But aside from that, why would you go through the logistical nightmare of landing on a beach rather than waiting a few hours and get to a proper port? I could understand if the ship was badly damaged or something, but the captain even says they'll be at a port in a few hours, yet they just decide to get off there and then. And after they ride in the dung cart. There's some really silly things in this to highlight the cultural differences between the Spanish and the English, such as Catherine demanding that she take at least one bath a day, even though this was the 16th century and barely anyone bathed. But, most stupidly, she says that she is going to take a siesta. Christ, why don't you just have her wearing a sombrero and have a pair of maracas whilst you're at it? Historically, she only said she was sleeping when Henry VII came, since she did not want to meet him or Arthur before the wedding, since that was the custom in Spain, which they do mention, but they just do that part so horribly, with Henry personally banging on her door saying he will break the hinges off. Again, if the real-life Henry VII talked like that, then that would be the end of that. Also, there is a stupid plotline with Prince Henry, the future Henry VIII, writing love letters to Catherine before she arrives in England, under Arthur's name, causing some embarrassment when Catherine and Arthur find out. I mean, what the hell was the motivation for that silly storyline? And it's brought up a few times as well. I mean, other than being a 10-year-old boy, Henry didn't show much enthusiasm at first. Hell, when his father spoke to him about the marriage when Henry was 12, he was directly asked if that was what he wanted, and he merely deferred to his father. We have some other stupid inaccuracies as well, like Henry VII and Elizabeth of York riding to see Arthur at Ludlow, when he was dying of what was probably the sweating sickness. Historically, they did not know about this until he had died and a messenger arrived, again, much like how it is portrayed in The Shadow of the Tower. From a practical standpoint, though, riding to Ludlow makes no sense, since if Arthur died of the sweating sickness, then in all likelihood, anyone in the area will be liable to catch it as well. I know your son is dying, but a king and queen would not even dare risk travelling to a place suffering from such an illness. Historically, monarchs would be more likely to shut the gates or even flee to another residence away from such an illness, not ride towards it. Also, Catherine herself was afflicted with an illness, possibly the sweating sickness, just after Arthur's death, which, could have been character building, but no, she's fit as a fiddle in this, and even rides a donkey to Arthur's funeral. We have other odd things that happened, like the series claiming that King James IV of Scotland is old and may die soon, even though he's only in his 30s at this point. Then there's the complete absence of Ferdinand of Aragon, who, whilst overshadowed by his wife of course, was still a fairly cunning ruler in his own right, and was the one who led the armies against the Moorish rebellion, whilst Isabella rallied the troops. Apparently in this series, Catherine does not know how to dance, when, as a princess of Spain, she would have been well taught and versed in that most vital part of court life. Not to mention they claim some of the dancers are English, yet they have French names. Then there is her knowing English right off the bat, when historically she had to speak Latin with Arthur. I could have forgiven this, since, fine, having it in English helps us, the audience, to understand things better. But they even went out of their way to state that she speaks English, when historically she did not at this point. As mentioned in the trailer Rant video, the big problem of aging up Henry is that historically his marriage to Catherine was postponed because he was too young. Hell, after Elizabeth of York died, Henry VII even contemplated marrying Catherine himself in order to keep the dowry. It was only when Isabella died and Ferdinand got into conflict with Joanna, Catherine's sister, that the king looked for a way to get out of it. In this series, though, everyone seems to be vehemently against the idea. Now on to casting. Charlotte Hope is alright as Catherine of Aragon. She has the right hair colour, but two things I do have to bring up. Firstly, she is in her mid-20s and is playing a teenage Catherine in the early episodes. Granted, this was a problem in the Six Wives TV series, but that was only the opening part of that episode. I think they should have got someone a bit younger, perhaps 18 or something like that. Secondly, she has something of a Spanish accent, which is good and better than that Mary Queen of Scots movie, but it does fade in and out a bit. I think I would have rather preferred a Spanish actress in that role. Other than that, though, she is a decent actress, and I cannot fault her on that role she was written to play. A shame, though, they make out Catherine to be a liar over her relationship with Arthur. While some have theorised that Catherine did consummate her marriage with Arthur, including historians like David Starkey, from my point of view, it is highly unlikely that she did. Yet in this series, she actually does, and then lies about it so she can marry Henry. I think the very Catholic and pious Catherine would not lie about that. Margaret Beaufort's actress was alright as well, although, again, while she was cunning and a major advisor to her son and grandson, she could be kinder on occasion. Laura Carmichael isn't too bad as Margaret Pole, but there are some odd decisions she makes, like still holding a candle for her brother, which I have already got into a bit. Other than that, though, I'm afraid to say that the casting is dreadful. Henry VII's actor, Elliot Cowan, is alright as an actor, but he does not look like the king at all, nor does he behave like the financial genius and shrewd politician Henry VII was. Just go watch James Maxwell in The Shadow of the Tower. He has not been beaten in that role, and with the way Tudor dramas are going, will never be beaten at this rate. Prince Arthur, played by Angus Imrie, is way too weak. Granted, he was only 15, but up until his death he was expected to live long, and was not such a wimp. Although, at least he is physically about the only person in this series who even vaguely resembles the person they are playing. I have to single out the two worst actors, though, to be Rory O'Connor and Georgie Henley, particularly the latter. And yes, she was good in The Liar Witch and the Wardrobe, but that was when she was 9. With Rory, who plays Prince Henry, I will yet again bring up the fact that he is way too old to be playing Henry, who was a boy of about 10 at this point. But then, of course, it's been retconned, so now he's a handsome hunk who looks older than his older brother. However, just the way he acts does not convey the image of even the real-life Prince Henry. They keep saying things like, "You have the soul of a poet," yet I have seen barely any indication of this so far. This Henry, with his whole prank letter thing, feels more like Bart Simpson than the highly cultured Renaissance Prince Henry was at this point. And then there is Georgie Henley, who plays Princess Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. Now, historically, she was about 12 at this point, yet she's been retconned to be in her 20s and is being married off to King James IV of Scotland, which of course did happen, but she's really reluctant to do so. I think I can be confident saying that the real-life Margaret did not have much of a chance to complain like this, since she was 12 and in an arranged marriage. What is worse, though, and I hate to say this, but Georgie Henley can't act. She has no emotion in most of her scenes and sounds like a disinterested customer service employee at an IT firm. I think the only time she even vaguely shows emotion is when she's crying when her mother died, but other than that, it's just bland. I know I'm sounding really nasty, and perhaps I'm not the best person to talk, and because it might just have been the script, but if that's the case, then she should have had better direction. Mary Tudor is also a bit older than what she should be, although she is actually a child, so well done for that. But she seems to be lacking red hair, which she's reputed to have had. Granted, though, there is one portrait where it does look a bit darker. This leads me on to another major problem: authenticity. Now, you can have a plot that makes some deviation from the history, but the world should at least feel like the historical one. Yet this is not the case with the Spanish princess. Whilst we do get a few bits in there, like people using the title Your Highness or Your Grace to refer to the king, which is correct for the time period, most of it is not. We have the cloisters from Hogwarts and the Royal Palace, which would not look like a religious building, although a few sets do have wood panelling, so well done with that, I suppose. The costumes looking absolutely cheap and atrocious, and just the general feel of the court, or lack of a feel. I mean, look here, Henry is meant to be addressing the people of the royal court, which historically would be in the hundreds, yet there is barely anyone here. At least the Mary Queen of Scots movie could afford a few crowd scenes. You get other odd things as well, though, like Catherine of Aragon riding in the aforementioned dung cart, Arthur's body not being put in a coffin on its journey from Ludlow to London. Oh, and by the way, he wasn't buried in London, but hey-ho, on we go. Weird things like the entire royal family being present at Elizabeth of York's bedside when she had been confined and would have only been with her ladies and physicians. The way people act as well just doesn't feel right. Remember, these people are meant to be royalty and members of the nobility, who would be very formal using titles and so forth. Here they keep calling each other stupid and historically inaccurate nicknames like Harry, Charlie, and the one that gets on my nerves the most, Meg.
Shut up, Meg.
Granted, people like Elizabeth I did give courtiers nicknames, but that was usually a reflection of how she saw them. So Dudley was her eyes, the Duke of Anjou was her frog, and so on. The closest I could find to someone's name being abbreviated would be Henry VIII calling Thomas Cromwell Crom, and even then I'm not sure if that is accurate. The language they use as well does not feel Tudor. I mean, okay, I don't expect the people to be speaking ye olde English, but there are certain words and phrases that sound like something highly educated royalty of the time would say. If I may go back to Elizabeth R for a moment, just listen to this dialogue.
Think of their terrors and uncertainties. Think of the foreign invasions and civil war to which they'll be subjected if the succession is not assured.
Succession! I have no intention of dying yet.
Not yet, Your Majesty, not for many years to come, please God. But you must consider the future.
Not I. You. You are the spirit who wanders abroad, gathering knowledge from the stars, while I am the earthbound mortal, the mere piece of clay, doing for the moment what must be done.
Apart from one scene with Margaret Beaufort, we don't even come close to hearing this sort of dialogue, and it feels all very modern. The clothes they wear, as I mentioned, look cheap, and more of a fantasy version of the real thing. I mean, Margaret Beaufort seems to be the only woman in England wearing an English hood, which was, the most common hood worn by noble ladies in England. Christ, I've seen comedies like The Two Ronnies and Blackadder that took more care with historical accuracy when it comes to costumes. Just look at what these Spanish soldiers are wearing. They look like crusaders had just been down for a jolly old trip to the Holy Land with Richard the Lionheart, not Spanish soldiers of the 16th century. Authenticity is important if you want to make a successful historical series, even if it has fictional elements. You can change characters all you like, but if the world does not feel right, then it will all fall apart, and things like costumes, scenery, language and so on are very important in achieving this. To illustrate this, I shall yet again be using another example from an anime, and that show is called Princess Principal. Now, Princess Principal is a show that does historical-based fiction very well. It is chock-a-block full of historical references. The setting is meant to be an alternate version of late Victorian Britain, called Albion in this show, which is also an alternative name for the British Isles. You have the Royal Coat of Arms, the Queen in this show looking a lot like Queen Victoria, the slums of the West End, one episode involving a killer nicknamed Jack, obviously a nod to Jack the Ripper, although this one uses poison gas. The country being split between the royalist Albion and an anti-monarchist country called the Commonwealth, a reference to the name of England under the rule of Oliver Cromwell. The soldiers having red coats and something resembling the Home Service helmet. This liner looking like a cross between the real-life Lusitania and Titanic. And there are probably 100 more things that I haven't mentioned. The series clearly put effort into researching the period they were more or less setting their show in, which the director confirmed in an interview not long after the series aired. That, to my mind, is one of the best ways to make your historical-based fiction good, by respecting the time period and, even if you have fictional characters, making the world at least believable. The show, however, does enough to make things different and, most vitally, interesting. The politics is reminiscent of the Cold War, with a large wall separating the kingdom and the Commonwealth, with spy rings on hazardous and dangerous missions. You have the steampunk setting, flying airships, and all sorts of mechanical contraptions, and the novelty that the main characters are mainly high school girls undercover. And if the police are watching, no, that is not the main reason why I watched this series. Even the English language version has them speaking with British accents, although you can sometimes tell they are Americans doing the voices.
Duke of Normandy is scheduled to arrive here in less than 20 minutes. How do you suppose we take the key?
Oh, I'm telling you! Oh, I'm English!
They even reference other works of historical fiction, like the whole storyline between Ange and Charlotte being based on Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper. I honestly would recommend Princess Principal as a show that does historical-based fiction right. It is a tragedy, though, that media like Mary Queen of Scots and the Spanish Princess are incapable of keeping the authenticity elements intact at the very least, and I have only scratched the surface of my complaints of that series. If I had watched the other episodes, then I expect I'd be here for another hour. Wolf Hall seems to be about the only recent Tudor-related drama that somewhat tried to maintain an authentic look. Although there does appear to be some hope across the channel, since some commenters have told me about a series called Carlos Rey Imperador, about Emperor Charles V, which does look to have better authentic visuals compared to the Spanish Princess. Still, I fear we are doomed to endure cheap-looking, inaccurate, and poorly written dramas that don't even really try to stick to the history. Some historical events and characters have been altered in the film for dramatic purposes. Yeah, Spanish Princess, you can sure say that again. Thank you for listening. This has been the Laughing Cavalier, wishing you a good day.